Hello and welcome. As always, I'm Abby. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told. And here's my question for today. What are the stories that we can be telling ourselves that make us feel empowered? We have a lot of stories that we tell ourselves, but not all of them are kind stories about ourselves and what we believe to be true of ourselves. I think this is a good question to ask once you start to realize you do have a choice in the stories you're telling yourself. This is on my mind today as we continue with part 2 of our conversation. Our conversation partner is Beth Fisher-Yoshida. She's one of the stewards of the CMM Institute, and among many, many other things, she's also the author of the new book, New Story, New Power, A Woman's Guide to Negotiation. She's got some great things to say in part 2 of this conversation around the stories that we tell ourselves, how we can empower ourselves, not only in negotiation, but in every area of our life. Like we said in part 1 of this conversation, negotiation isn't something that only happens in businesses, in boardrooms, or behind closed doors in a work environment. We are always negotiating. And so this is really a conversation for everyone. So my hope is that through part 2 of this conversation, you can find some real meaning here in terms of thinking about the stories you tell yourself, thinking about your life and your conversations in terms of negotiation and how you can empower yourself in those stories, in the negotiating you do in your life. So let's jump back in with Beth. I want to get into your book more to kind of do that. What I like about even just how you frame your book in the very first sentence of the description of your book, saying we internalize so much, so many stories. And I think that like internalized sexism or misogyny or patriarchy is a really powerful tool and part of the answer to what you're asking around this dichotomy of you can be strong and you can be submissive. You can show up differently to different spaces as a woman. Because for me consciously, I can say, oh, well, sexism is bad and everyone deserves equity and equality and to be able to live into their full humanity. And at the same time, I can have internalized sexism living in me that, like I was saying earlier, makes me feel like I'm in competition with other women or block me from being able to celebrate other women's successes because it feels like a threat on my own or something like that. So I think the internalization is a big key. Because like there's the stories of our lives, of our families, and then there's also the stories of our cultures and our systems that we do exist in, and we internalize them all the same, maybe.
Yeah, and I was sitting here thinking about that. I'm thinking about, well, there are good stories we internalize, not so good stories. And then I was thinking about the submissiveness. I think it's also about being vulnerable, right? And so there's, maybe because I'm from New York and the US, there's a sense of agency.
Yeah.
So if I choose to be vulnerable in a particular situation, then that's my choice, right? And then I feel comfortable enough and safe enough to be vulnerable. If I am pushed into a situation where I'm feeling vulnerable and not safe because I didn't choose, that's a different situation. I think you can be submissive. You don't have to be dominant all the time. You could be submissive, but you're choosing that. So that's part 2. We internalize so much. And I think this is why I'm so big on self-awareness, is because we don't even know. We don't know what we don't know, right? So we don't even know what we've internalized. And so sometimes, people have reactions to things. And we're like, well, where did that come from? Like, why did I have that kind of visceral reaction to something that seems so innocuous? And then it's because we've internalized some of the story about it, right? So maybe, excuse me, not to get too psychological, but maybe we've had some kind of situation where it was a little bit traumatic for us and something else like triggers that trauma, or maybe we were, for example, one of the big things is, so we're taught, respect your elders. And a lot of cultures have a very strong ethos around that. You respect your elders, you don't answer back, and so on. So if you're in a negotiation and you're negotiating, regardless of the gender, you're negotiating with somebody who's older than you, you have that story in the back of your mind that may not be conscious, but it's like respect your elders. And then you have these other stories where recently we just scream at women, you need to get out there and ask for what you want. You know, if you don't do it, nobody's going to do it. You got to be your own best advocate and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
We have these competing stories, right? So then we go in and we've consciously prepared for the negotiation. We're going to assert, we're going to ask, we're going to, you know, do all these things. And then we get in there, we're dealing with an older person. Then we're thinking, oh, wow. And suddenly you're feeling like really uncomfortable trying to assert yourself. And you're like, what's going on? I prepared so well. Why am I getting so nervous about it? Why do I feel it's not right for me to do it? Why do I feel that maybe I don't want to challenge them? And then you have this conversation going on in your head. It's like, wait a minute, challenging, you're supposed to assert yourself. No, but you're challenging authority. Like, what is going on? So you need to understand where those stories are you've internalized as a good girl does, right? The message that we should be girls, we should be likable and nice. We've internalized that story, and that gets in the way of us advocating for ourselves. So we have to come to some kind of understanding about what does that mean. So how do we assert and advocate for ourselves without being rude and without challenging in a negative way? So we are challenging the status quo because we want something more, but how do we do it in a way that's still nice? Now, we may not be able to get there. So we have to think about, okay, which is more important to me? Is it more important to me to just stay where I am as long as I'm respectful? Or is it more important to me to push the edge a little bit to get more about what I want and then risk being disliked or risk being thought of as abrasive, even if I'm trying not to be? But that's my framing. I don't know completely what the other person's reaction is going to be to me. This is all in my own head before I even get in there. And this is what we do. So internalizing all those stories, we need to make them explicit to understand what they are, where they're from, and why they're causing us to behave the way we do.
Yeah. One of the stories that is interesting to me is about, if you're thinking about equality, say, you know, between men and women or between all genders, the kind of unspoken story there is that we're saying, oh, well, women want to be equal to men, but that's saying that a man's way of being is the ideal way of being. Whereas there's a flip side of that to say, well, as a woman, there are things that I'm allowed to, it's socially acceptable for me to express my emotions in this way, or to communicate in this way, or to care about my relationships in this way. Don't you men, you know, or other genders, don't you want some of that too, where it's like not just women being equal to men, but everyone being equal to each other, in the sense that everybody gets to be their full humanity, have all the qualities, not just the ones that are, quote, feminine or masculine. And so it's interesting to me to think about, when you are empowering women in their negotiation skills, there's more nuance there than you just saying, we'll negotiate like a man.
Right.
Quote unquote, you know, because you're saying like the ways that you show up are already good enough. The culture, the story that you've been told is that it's not, but let's do that second step that we talked about earlier, not just recruitment, but, you know, the staying power of like, how do we create a new story, a new culture, a new society in a company, in a community that has the space for all these different ways of being and ways of showing up to negotiating. That's not, well, just be more like a man.
Yeah. Well, it's funny too that, so I was thinking, well, you know, it's not only about women's stories. I mean, men have stories too. And I'm not getting into that. Somebody else can because they have their own. So while you're in a negotiation, it's all about the relationship, right? So you're in relationship with this other person. So that is also a way of lowering the anxiety a little bit. It's like, oh my God, this is a negotiation. Well, no. It's like, hey, I'm curious about this person. I'm going to get to know this person better. So who am I in relationship to this person? So whatever you do or don't do, whatever you say or don't say, just by showing up, you're already triggering something in that other person, because that other person has his or her own stories that they're carrying, right? So if a man is in a negotiation with you and he grew up with the message that, you know, men control the world or men are more dominant, whatever that extreme kind of story could be, and you're coming in there and you're trying to assert yourself, or he perceives you are asserting, and then he might perceive that you are encroaching on his territory, and then may become defensive, may become uncomfortable, and then have his own way of reacting to that. So whatever you do, you're going into a situation and you're triggering something in that person. So that's something to be aware of too. Now, you can't necessarily help it, and you can't always predict it, but you need to be aware that that's happening. So then you have to figure out, as much as I advocate for self-awareness, I also advocate for other awareness. So I need to figure out who this person is that I'm negotiating with, and I do as much prep as I can in advance. And then whatever prep I do in advance, during the course of the negotiation, I am trying to figure out if what I prepared is accurate or not, and to continue to modify what I know, because as I'm going through the process of the negotiation, I'm learning more about this other person. I'm learning more about myself in relationship with this other person, the context where we are. You know, the self-other context to me is very much CMM. I took that from CMM. All of those dynamics are playing around at the same time, because me having a conversation with any other person in a different context would be a different conversation, because the environment, the setting would just add something or take something away to the fluidity of our conversation that we're having. So I need to be aware of that. And it is interesting. And I'm saying, yeah, you know, no, don't negotiate like a man, but you can learn from what men do. So I remember there's a woman named Deborah Kolb, who was one of the leaders of looking at women in negotiation. And she talked about how the typical sort of setup of a negotiation, like almost adversarial across a table, a very male way of looking at that. And she talks about, you know, like a woman's seat at the table, right? You know, so we're talking about the table, the negotiation table, and that you need a place at the table or to have voice at the table. So yeah, so it's not about negotiating like a man, but learning from what they do, because one of the historical things, and there's a book called Women Don't Ask, like women, and people have said to me when I've interviewed them, I didn't know I could ask for that.
Right.
And men, it's like, of course we ask for that. Like, why would you not ask for that? Like, that's just not even a question that they raise, because we're raised differently. We're nurtured differently. And we have different stories about who we are in the world just because of our gender.
You're taking me back to what you said about riding bicycles earlier. And, you know, when one person learned to ride a bicycle, it got a little bit easier for everyone else to ride a bicycle. And that makes me think about, you know, not that I'm saying anything new, but representation matters, and the way people talk about that. Say, if you never see a woman in any leadership position, then how are you supposed to, in your own imagination as a child or whoever, believe that you could also be that? And so it makes sense to me that, you know, the more women learn to ask for whatever, you know, fill in the blank, the more women learn to say no and stand up for themselves, or, you know, the list goes on and on of things that I'm hopeful that women can continue to be empowered to do in ways that men are already empowered to do. It's like, that makes me feel hopeful, I guess, kind of that framework that you offered earlier, to say the more that one woman can do this, the more women can follow, because it opens up that door. And it makes sense that, you know, you could get a whole group of men say, oh, well, yeah, of course we ask for this. Of course we are assertive in this way. Of course we show up in this way. Of course we communicate in this way, because that's what their models have told them. That's their, you know, version of riding the bike.
So another thing related to that is, a lot of times women will say to me, oh, it's so hard, you know, I feel so uncomfortable doing that. It's really outside of my comfort zone. And I say, okay, so are you comfortable now with the way things are? And they'll say, well, no. I'm like, okay, and you're uncomfortable doing something different. So, all right, so you have two kinds of discomfort.
Right.
Which do you choose? Because both are uncomfortable. If you stay the way it is and don't do anything, then you're accepting. You're condoning. You're saying, okay, I accept this situation, and it's going to stay the same or get worse. It's not going to get better, probably. Or you can try that discomfort, and then at least you have an opportunity that maybe something will improve. And so then I also think about, you know, for me in my own negotiations too, I'm thinking, okay, it's not only me negotiating for Beth, but it's me negotiating on behalf of every other woman in the world, because I'm thinking, if I give out and if I give in and if I don't try and I don't do it, I'm just making it more difficult for other women coming after me. I need to do something and set the bar where people can reach it better. So I need to demonstrate something in there. So now research has shown that women advocate for others better than they advocate for themselves. So that might be helpful too.
Oh, yeah.
So if women say, okay, you know what? It's not only about me. I'm doing this on behalf of all my sisters around the world. Then maybe that would ease some of the discomfort that they have in thinking of themselves as pushy or going forward in discomfort, because they're paving the way for other women after them.
Yeah, that is interesting. And another podcast that I like to listen to is Glennon Doyle's We Can Do Hard Things. And she uses kind of similar language to say exactly what you're just saying. Staying in a situation that doesn't feel good for you is hard. Leaving is also hard. So just what's your quote unquote right kind of hard? What kind of hard do you want to be doing? And what you're saying is what kind of, uncomfortable are you going to, power through? It makes me think that I think a lot of women choose their own discomfort, like, say like I'll choose a situation where I'm uncomfortable over a situation where I'm worried I'm going to make someone else uncomfortable by asking for too much, by being too loud, by being too much. And so it is interesting where it's like that is a big way that women are socialized to be the regulators of other people's emotions and experiences, and to, be selfless. And that's, such high praise for women to be so selfless, to always be thinking about others and their own comfort. But I like that reframing of like, you can still have that value of like, I'm being considerate of others' experience by standing up for myself. It's actually more considerate,
right?
If you can frame it that way, for all the other women in the world, for my daughters, for my mother, for, everyone else, that I'm putting out the vibration of here's one more woman who's learning to stand up for herself. I think that's really beautiful.
It's interesting too that, when I have two daughters, and so raising my daughters, people say, oh my God, how do you do it all? I say, well, not well, because you're working and you're this and you're that. And, I think that, I don't know if all, but I would say a lot of mothers who work outside the home, because all mothers work in the home and outside the home. So if you choose to work outside the home, or you need to work outside the home, it's not a choice, and you have children, then there's part of you, like that 1 to 99% that's still in the home and feeling bad that you're not there. So, and I have to say that over the years, most of the time I was able to be there for the significant events, but there were some times when I couldn't. And that was just heart-wrenching, especially with my younger daughter. There was this video once of her at this event with her grandmother, and she was just like, it was a mother-daughter race, and she was just like schlepping her feet along with her grandmother. She was about 4 or 5 years old. And I just couldn't be there that day. And when I saw that video, it just broke my heart. Even today, I can still, and she's like in her 30s, I can still just get upset about that. But then after a while, and they said, Ma, you were a really good model, good role model. So at the end of the day, did I make all the best choices? Probably not. There are probably some better choices I could have made along the way, but you're still modeling something. And then when I look at young women wanting to learn from me or study from me because they've noticed me somewhere or admire something, it's like, oh, wow, so I don't do it for that. I do it because as a practitioner and an educator, I've been an educator in some form or another my whole life. Then I'm thinking, well, my adult life, then I'm thinking that what's the message, what's the message I want to impart? And it really is about the sense of agency and the sense of self-awareness and the sense of knowing what you need to know. And here's the way to do it. Because every time I learn something new, I'm always thinking, how can I use this? How can I integrate this? So if I learn some theory or research, whatever, or I see something, I hear something, how can I integrate this into what I'm doing? And so one of the more recent things I've done is looking at the neurosciences, because that's become a big thing. Yeah. I was trying to figure out, what is this? Because I remember my former career, before I got involved in all this, was in special education. And I work with kids with learning and behavioral disorders, which I'm not even sure what the PC terminology is today. But kids who had normal or above intelligence, but had difficulty learning. So in those days, in the 70s, we didn't have the kind of imaging that we have now. It's like 50 years later, we have all this wonderful imaging where we can look and see what parts of the brain activate when different things are happening. And the Hebbian theory about neurons that fire together, wire together. So we associate different things together. And then I read a book about emotions and how the social construction of emotions, and, CMM also has a foot in social construction, isn't that we created these worlds, we can create better worlds, right? We can disassemble it and reassemble it and all of that. So I started putting some of this together, thinking, okay, how can I use this? Like, how does this make sense? And it's good to understand that if we have any kind of trepidation about a negotiation, and even though we prepare and we still may not feel super prepared, going in there and just showing up, the part you're talking about before with that other podcast, showing up is already an accomplishment. So what if we rewire that association of the trepidation of negotiation with showing up and putting in the effort? So now when we hear negotiation, we see effort and positivity, and we just showed up. Even if you don't get the outcomes you want from the negotiation, the fact that you showed up is enough of a reward. So we have to continue to rewire. So you can't unwire, right? You have to rewire. So that means you have to have something alternative. So you consciously commend yourself, pat yourself on the back, whatever you need to do to celebrate the fact that you showed up, the fact that you didn't back down, the fact that you prepared and you were there. So just that alone. So then I started thinking about that. So that's another way of thinking about how to prepare ourselves for that. And so I think we need to celebrate ourselves all along the way and not be hard on ourselves, because life is hard. Life is tough every day. Just the fact that you can get out of bed in the morning and do what you have to do and face the world, that's a big accomplishment. You should commend yourself on that. But I think too often we don't do that. I mean, I don't do that either all the time either. I'm like, hey, today, great. No, I don't do that. But just to be in touch with, like, I got out of bed today and what am I happy about? What am I excited about today? Wow, I have a negotiation. Like, yes, I'm going to show up, or I'm going to negotiate, whatever it is. And I always encourage too, don't go out and do the most difficult negotiation around the most difficult issues with the most difficult person in your life. Don't do that to yourself. Start really small.
Yeah.
Even if it means just a little bit of a negotiation about what am I eating for lunch today? Where are we going to go for lunch? Or just little negotiations. Just practice that and sort of build your negotiation muscles. So the next time it becomes that much easier. And even though it won't always be easy, there'll always be some challenge, at least you're more prepared and you have the experience and the success of the experience to boost you for the next round.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm appreciative of all the stories that you've already shared. I think those are so helpful to understand this whole conversation we're having. And I'm just curious to, go back to dig a little deeper. If you have any personal experiences that you'd be willing to share that you have off the top of your head that maybe has been part of your self-awareness journey, to say where you are now, like what are the moments in your life that make you so excited to empower other women and that give you this lens of gender to have such a powerful role in your life and your work?
So when I lived in Japan, one of the reasons I went there originally was to study art and study calligraphy and live with a family and teach English. And there's a whole story behind how I got there, but I got to Japan and I was young. It was just about a year after I graduated university, probably. So I had been a year traveling through Europe, and then I came back and then I went to Japan. So I was studying brush painting, which is sumi-e, with an older man, like a grandfatherly figure. And I was studying calligraphy with a little woman, like a grandmother. So I had the grandfather and the grandmother. And at that time, I was macrobiotic, so I didn't eat sugars, and I was very strict macrobiotic, vegan. And I also have an art background, so I came out of the US culture of be yourself, be creative, be individual, right? Very, very strong messaging that I took up very strongly because I come from New York, and I want to be myself and be an individual. So then I go to Japan and I'm studying with the man, and he is saying, this is how you hold the brush, and this is how you put the ink on the brush. And then he's giving me very strict compositions. He said, this is where the rock goes, and this is where the tree goes. And I was like, oh my God, and he would sit there and he would demonstrate. And then I would go home and practice, then I'd bring it back and he would correct it. So I would do like black ink and he would take this orange ink and just correct it. And then at the end of our session, his wife would come upstairs and she would tell me, she knew I didn't eat sweets. So she would tell me in Japanese, this is not sweet. Meanwhile, it's like strawberry shortcake, chocolate. I mean, there's all these very sweet things. And I remember thinking, what part of that is not sweet? And I didn't really speak Japanese. So I was like, hand gestures and all that, and the obligation of, should I eat it? Is it rude not to eat it? The whole thing, and just getting really annoyed. This went on for like 6 months. I would go there weekly, and for 6 months, I was just getting angrier and angrier. I was just so annoyed. And I was belittling them, like, who do they think they are? And I've been studying art for all these years. How is he telling me how to hold a brush? And why is she telling me this is not sweet? It's strawberry shortcake. Of course it's sweet. You know, thing. And then one day I remember I just started crying by myself. I just was so frustrated. And I said, what is wrong with you? And I just had this epiphany of like, what is wrong with you? They didn't ask for you to come to them. You chose to go to them, and you chose to study art and calligraphy. You chose that. So why don't you just stop being such an idiot and just go in there and just relax a little bit? So I had to work on myself to really just go with the flow. I'm there to learn from them. What they're teaching me is not a threat to who I am or what I know. It's just enhancing all that. So I studied with them for 6 years, and I just adored them. Wow. I did make advancements in my work, and not my calligraphy as much, but in my painting I did. And it was just amazing, and I got to, like, if I ate the sweet or I didn't eat the sweet, I wasn't going to die from it. It was being acrobatic. So I just learned a lot. And then I also so that was me about learning and about cultural differences and how to understand and how to open up to different kind of possibilities. And that when you intake other things, it's not a threat to your core, because you are who you are, but it enhances and modifies in different ways. And being an American woman in Japan, I had different kinds of opportunities than Japanese women did because I was foreign. So they put me in this other kind of category. Whereas in an organizational context, Japanese women in those days, and probably still to this day to some degree, when they first come into an organization, are called OLs, office ladies. And basically, it doesn't matter what their educational background is. They make tea, they serve tea and coffee. And
wow.
A lot of times in those days, and maybe today to some degree, they were viewed as coming into the organization to meet a man, to get married, and then go have babies and have a family.
Yeah.
So they weren't given the same career opportunities because they weren't serious, right? Whereas I was, and I didn't work in a traditional Japanese firm, I worked in a foreign firm in Japan. So I worked at an international school. I worked for McKinsey and Company. So I worked in places where being an American woman was more acceptable than not. So I wasn't in a traditional, like a Mitsubishi or something like that. So that helped, even though I worked with some traditional Japanese people in the organization, I was not expected to be a traditional Japanese person. I was a foreigner. So that also made me more aware too of women. And that's another dichotomy there too, because Japanese women, as sort of submissive as they may need to be in the workplace, they're the ones who control the purse strings at home. So, the guy comes home with his monthly salary and she's in charge of it. And then she doles out an allowance back to him. So that's interesting too. It's like, yes. And they're also fierce. So the appearance of a culture being very patriarchal or not, like in the US, like I said, people think, well, we're all liberated. Well, we're not. But the myth is that we are. And then you go to these other cultures where they're supposed to be more like macho patriarchy, but they're also very liberated. So it's really a lot more nuanced than we think.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks for sharing that story. That is interesting. And that gets me back to the meaning making of like, what we consider to be liberated or not is different, or what we, consider to be norms for gender is different across cultures too, which I think that's why I think it can do so much for us. It can be so rich too. Like, it seems like you've had a lot of experience with, is getting to immerse yourself in other cultures and knowing the people that are a part of them and learning about that and understanding that to be able to expand your understanding of meaning making.
Sure. Yeah. Because it gets so nuanced. And then you even start to question, like, well, why do I have the beliefs that I have? Like, where did that come from?
Yeah. I want to get a little bit more into your book, New Story, New Power. What is the new story? that you're hoping to tell women in this book?
Yeah, good question. So the new story is really that we are a lot more capable than we think we are. We can work with who we are and work with our stories if we become aware of what they are and use them to our own advantage and the advantage of others. Because you think about being in a relationship, I like to think about it as a collaborative process. So if you think about relationship building in a negotiation, you know, sometimes we think, well, I'm only going to have this one conversation with this person, I'll never see him or her again. You never know. You never know who pops up back in your life again. Or if you have an issue with this person, chances are that you need to work out that issue, because that issue will appear in other people, in your lessons to learn through life, right? So that's the new story. The new story is understanding self and understanding what I bring, what I'm capable of. And that's a new sense of power, because there's a sense of agency and developing your skills and your awareness. That's the new power. And I have to say, it wasn't my title. You know, I cleverly wrote a title that didn't even have the word negotiation in it at the beginning. I had story in there, but no negotiation. And then my editor and the publisher and the production manager, they all got together and were brainstorming different ideas. And then they gave me a couple to choose from. I said, oh, wow, this is good. And then the more I've talked about this title, the more like I love the title, because I think it's just a good title and people like the title too. So I give them all the credit. It was their idea. And I love that they did it and didn't take what I put down. I don't remember what I put down, but it was nothing that would have been useful as a negotiation book.
Yeah, I always appreciate using that frame of stories. And so I think that's a really valuable tool to hand women to, is to, let's talk about your negotiation and let's do it through a frame of what are the stories you're telling? What stories do you want to be telling? And yeah.
I think it's also a way of empowering. So as I mentioned earlier, when you identify the stories that govern your life, you figure out which are the ones that work and which are the ones that don't. Even that weeding out those stories, that's also a sense of empowerment. You know, you're choosing, like, I'm going to keep this story and I'm going to change the other story because it doesn't work for me. You know, it doesn't work anymore. So like an analogy I like to give is when I talk to students or people I'm coaching in a workshop, I'll say, you know, all of you have succeeded so much in your life so far. You got to where you are. You're either in this program, you're in the workshop, you're in the organization, you've succeeded very well. You know, so you should really commend yourself on being the mature professionals that you are. And then just picture going home for family holiday dinner. And usually people just start laughing. They go, oh my God, because you're out in the world and you're advancing yourself and you're changing your stories, but your family, they have all those old stories that have not grown with you. So you go home and then let's just say you drop a piece of food in your lap and they go, oh yeah, you always were very sloppy. You know, you always did get dirty, or, you know, that kind of thing. They're like, oh my God, I'm that 8-year-old or that 12-year-old all over again. I thought I've advanced it. Or you say to yourself, I am not going to be triggered by Uncle so-and-so because I know he's going to say something.
Yeah.
It's going to trigger me. And then you say, I'm not going to fall into it. I'm not. And then he says something and you just can't stand it. Or you're talking about politics and you just go there. So those are the things that we have to still have control over. That's really hard because those stories are so old and so deeply embedded. It's hard. And it's very hard for people to change and mature their stories about you, because that means they have to change their stories about them because you're in relationship. So if you're not that, then they're not the same either. So now who are they? So that's why I like the idea of like systems therapy and not just individual therapy, because you have to change maybe individually too, but with your family system to support the change you want to make.
Yeah, I think that's an important point of that. Yeah, again, we said that the meaning originally was co-created, and so you can't hope to go back and create the new meaning in isolation. That's also going to be a collaborative process for sure.
That's right. That's right.
I know you'll recognize the CMM-ish language here, but this is how I want to try to keep ending my conversations, and that even that language in and of itself is a little confusing because I don't want the conversation to end. You know, I want to think about what are the next turns, maybe for people who have listened to this conversation with us, people who have read your book, people who are maybe in that building self-awareness stage. What do you hope for people after listening to this conversation to keep this idea alive in their own lives?
I think life is exciting and every day is an opportunity to be better than the day before, you to be better, the world to be better. So, set little milestones, little markers along the way to work towards as a way of motivating yourself, if that's what works for you, and to congratulate yourself. And that it's really, even when things are challenging, it's a way to take a step back and say, that's interesting. I wonder why that happened, or I wonder why he said that. I wonder whatever it is, even in the most challenging situations, or if things are like what is going on in the universe today, that like you just take a step back and just take a breath and go on, so that there are practical ways of moving forward. And if this can be overwhelming, then just take one little step at a time, one little movement at a time, and then just continue to build that. And I am going to say also a plug here that what I've been offering to people is, if you read my book, and maybe not every page, but if you read my book enough to know what it is, and you write a positive review for the book on Amazon and let me know, I will offer you a 1-hour free coaching session. So that's something that is out there in the public.
Great.
Yeah. I think it will expire at the end of this calendar year, but that's kind of what's out there right now.
That's great. Yeah, I just want people to keep, having the tools to keep this going, not just, listen to this conversation and then turn off the podcast and forget about it, but to, start doing some of that reframing and self-awareness work. And so those are some good next turns.
And the process of making things explicit that you take for granted, that's just such a part of you, is just part of your with who you are. And through CMM, you can surface different aspects of who you are.
Yeah. Well, Beth, what else do you want to say about your book or your work or your own stories before we wrap up today?
It's been an adventure. It's not done. I'm still curious and still moving on and still building on it. And every time I am in conversation with somebody about it, about the topic, then I always take away something too. And it's a way of me also refining my own thoughts in process. I used to be a lot more extroverted than I am, but I still have a little bit of extroversion where I like to think through things in conversation, and that we really all have a lot of agency, even within constraints. And constraints are not necessarily a bad thing, but there's also a way of putting a boundary around where the space that we can be creative inside of. So that if people are not familiar with CMM, I encourage you to keep experimenting with it. If you are familiar, for me, and it's been since the 1990s, I'm still learning new ways of using it, new ways of engaging with the information and the material. And I learn by sharing it with other people and then seeing what comes back from their use and understanding of it. And I remember that Barnett was very generous in spirit. I would say, well, is it this or is that? And he would say, yes. So it was always very generative and generous.
Yeah.
And so trying to keep that spirit alive as well. It's been really helpful.
Yeah.
So
that's wonderful.
For the conversation today. I've enjoyed it immensely.
Thank you, Beth. I really appreciate you sharing your time and your stories with me. Okay, that is all for our conversation with Beth. This has given me so many things to think about, and I hope it has given you lots to consider as well. In order to prompt a little bit of the reflecting I think all of us will be doing after this episode, I want to point you towards the 3 questions that I have at the top of the show notes. They are, how can we build awareness of ourselves, others, and all the stories that we have? How can we rewire our ways of thinking and being to better celebrate the ways that we do show up? And what does it look like to empower ourselves in our storytelling? I offer these questions to you as a next turn in order to continue this conversation in your own life. I think Beth presented us with a lot of amazing ideas today, so it's kind of up to us now to integrate them into our lives however we can. As always, I am supported by the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. This podcast is one of many initiatives designed to move us a little bit closer to those better social worlds that we are always talking about. Finally, some podcast-specific next turns I'd like to offer you are to share this episode with someone you want to invite into the conversation. The conversation doesn't end when the podcast episode does. I hope you continue to reflect on the things we talked about today. And one great way to keep the conversation going is to invite other people in your life in through listening to episodes. So share part 1 and part 2 of this conversation with someone that you want to bring in. Another way to continue the conversation is, of course, to reach out to me. I love to hear from you, questions, ideas, comments, thoughts. You can do that through the website, through email, and through Instagram and YouTube, where you can comment. The links to all of those places are in the show notes, so I hope you'll reach out to me there. Thank you so much for showing up. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abby, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told. Bye.